20,000 years ago, the Ice Age reached the last glacial maximum. As the climate subsequently warmed, the ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Northern Europe melted. So did most high elevation glaciers. Massive freshwater lakes formed as the ice retreated, sporadically bursting open as ice dams gave way. So much ice were leaving the continent that the seas were rising fast, flooding land, altering currents, and accelerating climate change. Entire valleys found themselves flooded underwater. Land bridges that connected continents and islands were submerged, creating new physical barriers to migration. Many of these valleys and lowlands had been ideal for survival. In the hyper-arid conditions leading to the last glacial maximum, there were only a few places globally where fresh water and so food could still be found in relative abundance. Like today, however, these lowlands and valleys were found close to sea level, a few dozen meters below today's sea level. Most human beings today live on the coast or in river lowlands near sea level as they did in the past. Just as rising water kill and displace people today, much bigger and more sudden events would have done the same in the past where human beings were isolated by the aridity of the global environment. These floods are thus later depicted in some of the first story ever written, deeply scarring the collective consciousness of the remnant human communities worldwide. Pushed out of traditional territories, having lost family and possession, most people had to find new places to live, new resources to gather, and new people to live with. Compounding problems even further was the progressive loss of megafauna to the aridity of the Ice Age. Climate refugees thus accelerated a cultural change that had begun before the last glacial maximum. Large animals that lived in herds were the primary food source of archaic human beings for most of our 2 million-year-old evolution. Our tools were made to kill and butcher them. Our clothes and shelter were made of their skin, guts, and fur. Our seasonal migration followed their herds around. When we started drawing on cave walls, we were drawing these animals. The bigger the species, the slower it evolves, and so it is less likely to survive abrupt changes and big disasters. We can observe as much during the many extinction events the Earth has undergone. Coinciding with the disappearance of megafauna are the extinction of their predators, including two of our evolutionary cousins, Homo denisova and Homo neanderthalensis. Homo sapiens survived the late Pleistocene by the skin of his teeth. However, the weather was becoming warmer and more humid. The isolated communities of human beings that survived through the aridity of the Ice Age were decimated by floods, but the survivor found ample new coastline and wetlands to colonize. However, survivors also found some places that were already inhabited by humans, often by refugees forced to migrate due to earlier disasters. While we might have found amenable conditions to survival, we also found many strangers coveting the same resources. Life before the last glacial maximum had been much simpler, albeit harsh. Now resources were becoming plentiful, but so were undesirable strangers. In reaction to the disappearance of megafauna that was almost complete by the last glacial maximum, we had to find new prey and new livelihoods. We developed more and more complex toolkit to hunt many different animals. We now had to hunt and fish for many smaller species to provide the same amount of resources as megafauna. Consequently, as different animals require different means of predation, there is more to teach and more to learn, making childhood last longer and social relationship more complex, as there are less functional adults and more dependent children in any given community. Increased complexity also means that there is more variability between communities, as each develop a material culture based on the specific resource available to them, which are becoming more regional and less homogeneous due to the loss of megafauna. Culture at this point is very much tied to the specific communities and specific resource in a confined geographical space. In other words, culture is made from the surrounding resources needed for survival. As refugees of climate disasters seek new resources, they meet other refugees, meaning that resources must be shared or secured. Differences in languages, physical features, clothing, and behavior have further developed since the loss of megafauna and serve as obstacle to collaboration then and now. Cultural fusion, assimilation, and genocide are a spectrum that develops on a case by case basis, often moving towards one end or another many times during the span of a group's cultural evolution. What is important to note is the need for more and more social rules that guide people in interacting with their new neighbors. In truth, we have been near extinction more than once, suffering through population bottlenecks which we can identify in our DNA, and we will be facing extinction again before we ultimately ceases to be. While we claim to control the fate of the world we live in, we as individuals are barely able to show basic restraint from fulfilling urges, which is why we claim to control the fate of the world we live in. The more control claimed, the less control exerted. Arrogance is proportional to ignorance. That is the very definition of hubris, a concept already well defined 2,500 years ago. The reality is that our ancestors intermingled with every other species of man they encountered until the line between each species was no longer present, at least within these families. It would be hard to argue that we were unable to do the same with other human beings. There was no doubt some violence between communities, just as there is violence within families. But presence of such behavior does not establish a rule, as people were evidently still able to raise half-breed children, as demonstrated by our DNA. The thought of a half-human, half-Neanderthal hybrid is enough to enrage some individuals living today, many of which are in positions of power within society, just as the thought of a half-indigenous, half-colonial hybrid goes against the pseudo-scientific interpretation of Darwinism and against the pseudo-scientific belief in the fixed social hierarchy of mammals. Integral to modern political and economic organization is the notion of distinct races in justified violent competition, with the most advanced races winning and enslaving the most barbaric. Many of the characteristics we identify as racial in each other are in fact physiological relics of the Pleistocene, as our species intermix with Neanderthal and Denisovans in isolated refugees before intermixing with other cultures as climate refugees. For example, Neanderthals had a large frame while Denisovid were diminutive in size, and so the people who carry their genes today still share some of these characteristics. There is no such thing as a pure human species, let alone a pure human race. As a method of organizing people, race, or its modern politically correct replacement, ethnicity, serve poorly yet still serve as the basis of modern society. Mass migration have changed everyday life faster than physiological traits can follow, making them obsolete in recognizing an individual's culture. In other words, what a person looks like is no longer an indication of where a person comes from, and this has increasingly been the case for at least 8,000 years. The exponential rise in the complexity of social life due to accelerated climate change and the death of megafauna meant that more and more information needed to be taken for granted by the individual so that the group as a whole could operate. There were too many tools, too many practices, too much etiquette, and too many rituals. As people migrated to our new environments, physical changes outpaced cultural changes, so that children were still being taught information that was not necessarily relevant to their own lives. Traditional division of labor then becomes impossible, as there is simply too much information available and not enough time to identify what is necessary and what isn't for survival. What was once specifically designed as a means of survival keeps on being practiced as ritual until individuals give rise to ritual practice. Ritual practice are actions that do not help them survive, but still they give the same amount of time and resources to them. Naturally, the result is death. Those who dedicate all their time and resources to ritual cannot survive unless they are dependent on others for survival. But what could the representative of ritual possibly provide in exchange of food and shelter and water? The answer is eternal life, or in other words, the very first pyramid scheme. Eternal life is only sought out when actual life is uncertain, meaning that climate change prevents the individual from living out his routine. In trying to adapt to new circumstances, we try to find the bigger picture, but this picture is always flawed, as in the end, the goal is purely the same as it was when things were going well. The goal is just self-preservation. Whatever understanding of the world we've accumulated over the ages, this knowledge has been first and foremost used to exploit others for the benefit of the individual. In seeking knowledge instead of harvesting or hunting, there must be a benefit to those who harvest and hunt in your stead. However, the benefit can only be more life. The promise of eternal life is so incredibly convenient, as it essentially means that no resources will ever be enough in the exchange between the holy man and the common man. Too much social complexity allows for exploitation, as our loyalty to obsolete rules trump our ability to figure things out by ourselves. As climate change accelerates, more people die due to the inability to adapt, which in turn causes refugees to amass. Diversity is the ultimate form of social complexity. It is impossible to sustain without forced migration, first created by climate change, then sustained by war. Eternal life gives new meaning to life, and to death, and to corpses. If people live forever after death, then their remains require extra care and attention. While caring for the dead might at first be for sanitary purposes, it develops into a huge expense of resources. Many of the dead are buried under structures of increasing complexity with resources that others, still alive, would have needed, indicating a rise in the inequality of distribution of resources. Dead ancestors become more important than neighbors in the sense that the former is getting more resources, time, and effort than the latter. Burial of the dead, along with drawing on cave walls, is one of the first physical indication of symbolic behavior and the first indication of symbolism siphoning resources away from survival to the extent that it would have caused people to suffer. Funerary resources are not the first structures built and relied on pre-existing traditions for their construction. Of course, just as with anything we've done, the practice was at first entirely practical. Hunting blinds across valleys and mountain passes were first created to hunt larger animals close to seasonal camps, where these animals were butchered and turned into food and tools. As megafauna almost entirely disappeared, we transitioned to hunting a wider variety of smaller animals, and we adopted the same construction principles. We built weirs and nets in water while building fences and enclosures on land. The purpose was initially the same: trap and kill more easily. Blinds once served as security against an animal that could kill you and at worst run away. No, kill you at worst and run away at best. As the name implies, prey would not see the danger until it was too late. Trapping too many at once would have been suicide, as animals were bigger and stronger than us. Now, however, the purpose was to prevent a host of smaller prey from running away while they were being butchered. Safety of the individual was no longer as important, and so killing prey became more indiscriminate. The relationship between prey and predator was not as respectful as it once was with megafauna. The killing of small prey has a quality of desperation not seen with megafauna. Butchering small prey is extremely time-consuming and is only done if there are enough prey to process at once. Also, smaller prey, as a rule, have a smaller territory than us and so do not require that we follow them around. Instead of traveling large distances following a herd of large beasts, we started finding locations where a wider variety of smaller animals could be periodically congregate, and we could hunt them. While there was still seasonal movement between different locations based on where animals congregated, these movements became smaller and smaller, the time being spent instead in learning more complex tool making and learning how to make war and peace with ever more refugee neighbors. Sedentary life encourages exploitation. Walls, once used solely to ambush prey, now become useful in keeping prey in one place indefinitely. Trapping prey become less and less common, instead breeding animals within the confines of their enclosure. Animals with desirable traits are bred together, leading to a final product that is much different than their wild ancestors. Domestication is incredibly inefficient. Much more work must be put into livestock than a wild herd. Animal must be fed, supervised, and kept in a specific location. Resources, once solely for the use of man, now become shared with domestic animals, which means less resources for people. The argument here is that the final product is more than the amount of grains, labor, and time needed to keep animals alive. But as that is not so. Domestication is an expense. While incredibly inefficient, domestication enables one man to claim resources as his property, to be used solely by him and his family, whereas hunter-gatherers would never dare claim wild animals as their own. The time and effort put into domestication requires a guarantee that the livestock will be beneficial to the person who put the time and effort, whereas there are no such guarantees in nature. That guarantee we provide by enclosures. Once used to ambush prey, then keep prey in one location, enclosures can also serve the purpose of preventing others from benefiting from domestic animals. Walls are then not purely practical in nature. They also come to serve as a social indicator of status and property. In other words, when we encounter a wall, we can be sure that whoever built it did not want us on the other side because they are in a better social position than we are. When conditions are stable, there is no need for domestication, as we can rely on knowing where wildlife will be at any given time to survive. Interfering in the natural cycle of the animals we rely on is time-consuming, and controlling their every movement necessary only when we want to prevent others from benefiting, which can imply three things. 1. The human population is too large. 2. Wildlife is diminishing. And 3. The human population is becoming greedier and consuming more resources. I believe all three are involved in the rise of domestication, property, and sedentary life. For domestication to be complete, we must take the child away from the mother so that we become the surrogate mother for the child and the surrogate child for the mother. That way, the child and mother will trust us with their lives so that we can eat their flesh, eat their young, and drink their milk. The manipulation of the family is necessary in the domestication of animals. Otherwise, we are nothing but a danger. Domestication is interference in the original social unit for the benefit of a less efficient, larger, and purely exploitative social unit. The domestication of plants went hand in hand with the domestication of animals, as water and food must be made available for domestic animals on top of the human population. In a fertile and peaceful environment, that is not a problem. However, as we've mentioned before, a fertile environment has more than enough wildlife to sustain a population of hunter-gatherers, so there is no need for domestication unless strife make people want to claim resources as their own. Domestication shows the increasing hostility of refugees toward one another, made possible by the cultural divide between refugees and, as time went by, between refugees and established sedentary population. Domestication is the main component of warlike culture. It fundamentally changes the dynamics of strife from competition for common resources to direct pillaging of each other's domestic products. Without all the concentrated wealth created by domestication, there is hardly a need to risk fighting other communities, and even less trying to establish an empire based on the continued pillaging of neighboring communities. Domestication is a practice in futility brought about by trying to protect resources against refugees. Resources must ultimately be considered property for people to waste so much time and effort making sure they remain where they are and where they can be defended from others, behind the walls of newly founded cities. Our lives become devoid of reason. Nothing stops us from treating each other as we treat animals, as we fundamentally share the same biological processes and so the same wants and needs. We all would like to breathe, drink, eat, sleep, and reproduce. I'm sure some of us would like to think ourselves as better than the animals we domesticate, just as we believe ourselves superior to the Neanderthals and Denisovans. But that is simply not the case. People can just as easily be domesticated as any other animal, and we can just as easily go extinct. A domestic animal has been separated from his mother during childhood to develop a foster relationship with its owner, whether that be a barn, a nursery, a school, a slave camp, or a workhouse, which is the predecessor of the modern job. Mother and child become alienated from each other. Growing up, the animal relies so much on its owner instead of its mother for water, food, and shelter that if the owner were to disappear, the animal would die, whereas the relationship with the mother is entirely optional because it is now useless. Once domesticated, the animal has forgotten how to look for water, food, and shelter and is content simply being led around to food, water, and shelter. Tantrums, however common due to the easy accessibility of resources. If there's never a hardship, there's never any reason to become mature. The animal, once sexually mature, is encouraged to reproduce, as its young can also become new property for the owner, further enabling his greed. So the animal reproduces even if he doesn't have the capacity to survive himself. The aim of human domestication is to labor until death, nothing else, as the domestic human cannot be used as food. Not due to ethical reasons, but due to the quick rebellion masters would face if slaves, serfs, and laborers were openly treated this way. Even if the animals were able to escape, it would have no reason to, because everything it knows is a result of the owner's interference. Owners become the worst surrogate mothers in history. The structure of the group mimics the relationship between man and nature, and so those at the bottom of social castes are in fact considered property whose labor rightfully belongs to those in power. Livestock. People treated as livestock build and maintain every aspect of urban life, including the walls and enclosures that keep them separate from their masters. Enclosures, just as places of worship, are the physical foundation of class structure. We worship those who claim through violence, who take the time to write their names down in our blood, while we sneer at those who suffer like us as a sort of existential suicide. Existence become predicated on servitude and worship of divine rulers. As the Greek Herodotus once said, once we're far away from home, everyone is a savage. As Aristotle once said, slavery is natural and necessary to life. As Plato once said, reality is not real. Only the ideas and incessant words of the rich are real. Thus officially begins our literary quest to keep most of the population enslaved, while a minority of individuals waste resources writing about how much they deserve more resources. Slave labor and human trafficking are but facets of domestications and will not disappear as long as we manipulate environments and species in paranoid fear of our refugee neighbors. Remember that domestication is not for the betterment of an environment. Domestication is about protecting property from people we don't like. However, as the people we don't like do the same, the evolution of urban life is essentially the escalation of conflict, as both competitive sides have more and more domestic animals, including humans, that can produce an army capable of destroying the other. Bigger cities means bigger enclosures. Bigger cities means bigger enclosures and bigger wars. As the goal of the alteration is to take more and more as fast as possible, environmental change accelerates where it was already incredibly fast, and the minimum stability required for domestication is compromised. Irrigation and agriculture ultimately fail amidst drought and flood, while animals, including humans, die en masse. Refugees seek shelter and are ultimately assimilated in the conqueror's lower class as livestock. Without war, there is no new labor force to be treated dismally, and so empires or modern states cannot be sustained otherwise. War is necessary to what we currently consider civility and progress. The only way forward is more irrigation, more agriculture, more domestication, and finally a larger population of slave humans. And a larger population of livestock that serve as labor for a select few and as soldiers ready to kill and die for their masters. Civilization in this sense, is very much a scorch or policy, meaning that our notion of civility is directly related to how unsustainable environment and destructive we can be to each other and to the world around us. The more we manipulate others, the better we think we are. Society is sociopathic. The bigger the disaster, the more potential there is for refugees, thus forever replenishing the domesticated class of first and third world laborers. Even though environmental conditions have stabilized since the last glacial maximum, the social structure established amidst the chaos of mass migrations have stayed the same and kept said chaos going. Amidst decreasing natural disasters and stabilizing condition, certain individuals throughout history have fallen prey to their unchecked desires and caused genocides that increased domestication, mimicking the same kind of instability that the Ice Age once created, thus making sure that comfort can only be attained by very few individuals and only through the exploitation of the less fortunate. If life was unfair before the advent of this domestication, we made sure that whatever stability nature provided could be torn apart by a succession of jealous, paranoid, and greedy individuals telling the masses to kill themselves for the greater good. Yet there was never a greater good, only individuals standing to gain from the constant violence that passes as normal life. Modern life is entirely about hoarding property. So when families have millennia to hoard resources and domesticate a strong labor force, they effectively have more than they can keep track of. To the average man, money is pointless, as he is more than able to carry what he needs to survive on his back. Such was the case for most of our evolution. To the average man, whatever resources used in the production of money would be more beneficial to him than the final product, which is in fact useless to him because he has no property in need of representation. To the average man, 5,000 years ago, just as today, we live day to day. Progress is claimed by those who waste the hard work of others. Money serves two purposes. For one, it is the measuring stick by which the wealthy man may compare their success, because they have too much to keep track, so now they need they need a numerical marker for their hoard. Basically, the bigger the sum, the more successful the individual. Second, domesticated humans believe that money is more important than their own lives and by extension will choose money over air, water, food, and shelter, effectively sabotaging themselves and their family into perpetual servitude. If everything on earth is claimed by a greedy man, then naturally the only remaining object can be owned by the poor is the symbol of the thing and not the thing itself. You might not be able to afford food for the day since the rich man is selling it at sky-high prices, so what good is the few coins to your name? Is life worth nothing but harvesting food that you cannot eat and cannot afford with the resulting salary? Such is the brilliance of modern man, having domesticated himself for the sake of fulfilling every desire imaginable. As society collapses under the meekness of domesticated human beings and their out-of-touch, sociopathic masters, extinction might not be too far away.